Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast once again, and today I have a special guest. Gabe Gordon is here. Gabe is an author of a recent book that's really cool called The Fundamentals of a Recovering Fundamentalist. There's links in the description here. We went to seminary together, and Gabe was my TA for historical theology. And now he's a grad student at Marquette University specializing in historical theology. And his interests are in early Greek and Syriac speaking Christianity and post-supersessionist Jewish Christian theology. And as you'll find out, Gabe's a very deep thinker, and I really admire his thoughtful approach to theology. I've learned a lot by discussing with him. I got a lot more comfortable with my post-Calvinist or my Calvinism and my post-Calvinist feelings by having great discussions with Gabe. So welcome, Gabe. And I'm so glad to see you.
Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate the opportunity. And it's fun to just come on the podcast with you. And I got to say, it's a little bit dangerous having me on video because who knows? Who knows what this will show. That with just audio, it might be a lot safer. So,
yeah. Well, most people just listen to audio because it's usually Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Well, bless those people.
But, okay, so first of all, give me a little bit of a bio about your spiritual journey and what path brought you to where you are now.
Sure. I'm going to start with today, and I'm going to do so in a very convoluted way, but then I'll explain it. So I would identify as an indigenizing and decolonizing Jewish Anglo-Orthodox Episcopal follower of Yeshua. And that, if you actually break that down, which I will, actually very precisely shows exactly where I'm at theologically and who I am. So the indigenizing part, if you might have caught, is connected to the Jewish piece, and so is the decolonizing piece. The idea is that all Christians, regardless of their ethnic background, are actually meant to indigenize their faith. That there's not meant to be this amorphous universal blob, but if you read the end of Revelation, every tribe, every tongue, every people group are actually present before the throne as their particular ethnic groups and cultural groups, rather than, again, this amorphous universal blob. So there's actually a commandment, I think, and you see this in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council, where Gentiles are not only are they not meant to follow the Torah in its wholeness, that they can actually be Gentiles in how they follow the Jewish Messiah, but they, I think, in some sense, are actually commanded to do so. And so my own indigenizing, because I'm Jewish, is to indigenize as a Jew. So for me, a few examples of that means eating kosher, observing Shabbat, the various Jewish festivals, and being visibly Jewish. So I wear a kippah on my head. I wear a sudra, which is the traditional Judean scarf. I wear tzitzit, which Yeshua himself actually wore, the woman who bled for 12 years. Translations don't always actually get it right, but it says it touches the hem of his garment. It's actually his tzitzit, which are these little fringes that are commanded in Deuteronomy for Jews to wear as to remember to observe the commandments given to Moses at Sinai. The decolonizing piece is refers to the fact that Jews, since the Enlightenment, when the nation states arose, and Jews actually have lived in the exile, not just in Europe, but in North Africa and the Middle East. It's kind of a misnomer that people think all Jews have just lived in Europe. But my particular Jewish ancestors were in Europe, and in Europe, at the rise of the nation states after the Enlightenment, you had this idea that we can't have nations inside of nations, and so the Jews were a problem, and the new European nation states essentially colonized ideologically the Jews, and they said, well, if you want to be citizens, if you want to have political emancipation, you actually need to look like us, you need to think like us, you need to act like us, and that process worked. There's generations of Jews in the 19th century on. Karl Marx, his family is actually an example of this. Einstein, and many Jews today that actually are very in the way they think and the way they act and the way they live and look is actually very much so,
Right.
According to the colonizers. So this idea, this need to decolonize, to not just think like a Western Christian, but to actually think and act and look like a Jew.
But you came out of Christian fundamentalism
Yes.
through Episcopalian
Yes.
to Judaism.
Yes.
Again.
So I actually didn't, and maybe we could talk about this if you'd like, but I actually didn't discover my Jewishness until I was older. My family told me I grew up with my mom's side of the family, and my family told me growing up that my father was Mexican.
Okay.
So when I was 18, I met him and actually found out he was Jewish.
Uh-huh.
And but nonetheless, when I did grow up with my mother's side of the family, who are Pentecostal, Northern European ethnic groups, and very fundamentalist theologically. And so that's certainly what I grew up in. When I was in college, in later high school, I discovered my Jewishness, and for a long time I didn't know what to do with that. In college, I started deconstructing.
Yeah.
And as I was deconstructing, I had this sense of that I wanted to identify with my Jewish roots, and I wanted to figure out exactly how to integrate that. And so I actually showed up at a Messianic synagogue. And not all Messianic synagogues, I got to preface this, are like this. It's kind of also a misnomer, a misunderstanding. But this particular Messianic synagogue was basically an evangelical fundamentalist Messianic synagogue.
Okay.
And so it was exactly what I was leaving, and I had wanted nothing to do with it.
Right.
And so because of that, I continue to put it on the back burner of figuring out how to indigenize. I wouldn't have put that language to it at the time, but then ended up Episcopalian after I got kicked out of a Southern Baptist church, actually just down the road on Aurora Avenue.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so about a 15-minute drive from where we're recording at the moment. So bittersweet, always coming back to this area. And ended up in the Episcopal Church, was moving theologically towards so that's why I'm an Episcopalian, as mentioned in that, and was moving towards more Catholic and Eastern Orthodox versions of Christianity. And so when I say I'm Anglo-Orthodox, I mean I'm a group of, within Anglicanism, you kind of have the whole gambit in some sense of most of Christianity. You have, you do find fundamentalists, you do find broad evangelicals in the 19th century sense. You find mainline or liberal Protestants, and you find Anglo-Catholics who are essentially Catholic in their theology, maybe more Catholic than the Pope. And then the Anglo-Orthodox, which is my group, are the people that are in a lot of ways Eastern Orthodox in their theology. And if they had to leave, they would probably go to the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so I kind of came into that camp even before I knew that was a camp. And so that really coalesced my identity and my theological influences, and how those are all kind of integrated and synthesized together, and the background that I come from.
And that's what brought you to where you are today, essentially.
Yes, yeah.
So in your book, which is amazing, actually we could probably even show the cover here. In the book, you obviously talk about fundamentalism and give some new insights. I think some people will find it very interesting, some of the insights that you have about fundamentalism. So first, could you just define fundamentalism from your point of view, what that means, and compared to what other people might think?
Yeah, I actually brought this book not to show it, but because I knew you were going to ask me this question, and I couldn't. There's always a couple of points that I forget. So oftentimes when people say evangelical, they mean fundamentalist.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think historically we need to actually differentiate these. I learned that when I went to Portland Seminary, which is an evangelical seminary, but it's certainly not fundamentalist. And so I think that's an important nuance. But for when I'm talking about fundamentalism, I mean essentially 5 points that come out of the late 19th century, which are the inerrancy of Scripture, the idea that the Bible has no errors, penal substitutionary atonement, which we both dislike. Not that we don't both dislike the first one either, but the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection, and the divinity of Yeshua.
Yeah.
And the only one of those that's actually new to the fundamentalist movement is the doctrine of inerrancy.
Yeah.
PSA at least goes back to Calvin.
Yeah.
And the other three are found within historic Christian
So that's
branches.
really a great point, is I think a lot of people get very confused between the new expressions of Calvinism, the neo-Calvinism, and fundamentalism and evangelical, because while there's overlaps there. How would you say fundamentalism as it's described today, because it does change, versus Calvinism as it is today?
Yeah, there's this term that we're both familiar with called neo-Calvinism. And in my Southern Baptist background, there were a lot of neo-Calvinists. The Southern Baptists, among probably PCA, maybe some other groups, were kind of the enclave, the core of the neo-Calvinist or young, restless, and reform movement.
Yeah.
And a lot of those groups, if not all of them, are fundamentalist theologically in the sense I just outlined.
Yeah.
But fundamentalism extends to, although it came from the Presbyterian Reformed world, it also extends and bled into Pentecostalism,
Yes,
which wasn't originally fundamentalist, but is certainly now often, and then in other various groups that were simply evangelical at one point. So, and evangelical in the sense of, as David Bebbington, who's a British scholar, describes it, there's 4 points. Biblicism, which essentially means sola scriptura.
Yeah.
Crucicentrism, conversionism, and social action, which includes evangelism and social justice. And so fundamentalism kind of is a movement that comes out in some ways out of the broader evangelical world, but not all evangelicals are fundamentalists.
Yeah. Not all fundamentalists are evangelical.
Yes, and not all fundamentalists are Calvinists.
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of, it's like a Venn diagram with interacting circles. And
Precisely.
When you speak a lot about fundamentalist methods, or how the fundamentalists create their theology, or develop theology using Scripture, when you look at it from, early church fathers' point of view, when you see how fundamentalists, how their methods seem to be, and this is one of the great insights that I've gotten from you, they use a lot of the same methods that liberal theologians have been using. And in fact, they're almost indistinguishable a lot of times. So could you tell us a little bit about that? What is it that... you'd think that they would be loggerheads, right?
Yeah.
But they're not.
Yeah. So, I'll tell a parable.
Okay.
The parable of the Frenchman. Have you ever heard of this parable? So the idea is that the parable goes this way. There was a man that moved to a new town in France, a small town, and he would go to a bakery every day. And at the bakery, he'd get a fresh baguette. And every time he went to the bakery, there was a man there. Every time he was there was the same man. And he hated the man. He thought he was arrogant. He thought he was bigoted. He thought he was irrational. He thought he was backwards. Basically, he's the worst of the worst. And the more he went to the bakery, the more he hated this man. And he eventually began to make some friends, and he would go out afterwards in the evenings and hang out with his friends at a cafe, and he would complain to his friends about this man at the bakery, and continued to do this for a long time. And eventually the friend says, I want to meet this man. And he says, well, I'll take you to the bakery. He's always there when I'm there. Always. And so they go to the bakery, and he sees the man, and he says, there's the man right there. I told you he would be here. And the friend looks at him, and he looks at the man, and he looks at him, and he looks at the man. And then he looks at his friend for the last time, and he says, you're looking into a mirror. So the idea is, right, from the parable, which I made up. I made that parable. So of course you would not have heard of it. And now
now we do.
Now we do. But the idea is that and you can, I with my own family, I look at my family, and the traits that I hate the most about them are the traits I see in myself. And so the idea is that we hate the people we hate the most, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, because they're us.
Yes.
And that's the case, I think, with fundamentalists and liberal Protestants, that they do argue a lot, and they act as if they are separate movements, they have separate ideologies, but in reality, they're really the same movement. And
Right.
Justo Gonzalez, the Cuban-American historical theologian, and Stephen Long, the Anglo-American Methodist scholar, have
right.
both made this point that the fundamentalist movement is essentially just as modernist as the liberal Protestant.
Yeah.
And if liberal Protestantism is an adopting or adapting Christianity according to modern sensibilities or Enlightenment sensibilities, Northern European sensibilities, all these are kind of ways of talking about the same thing, then fundamentalism absolutely is a liberal Protestant movement. It's doing the same thing. Inerrancy is a very modernist doctrine.
It didn't exist before.
Precisely, before the Enlightenment. It is only made possible with Enlightenment philosophy.
Yeah.
And so, and some of these, both groups ask the same questions. So both of them will ask, can we prove scientifically that miracles and the resurrection, for instance, can we prove that scientifically? The liberal Protestants will say, well, of course not. And the fundamentalists will say, of course, yes. They're not actually, they're asking the same question. So they're fundamentally operating with the same modernist assumptions. They read the Bible the same way.
Right.
The fundamentalists will prefer to call it the historical grammatical method. And they'll say, well, we don't really do historical criticism, but they're doing historical criticism. It's not any different. My first master's at Portland was in biblical studies, and I grew up, with the historical critical method. I went to a Southern Baptist university and was in the theology department, and that's what we were taught. The Gordon Fees, how to read the Bible textbook, which proposed the historical critical.
What a lot of people would think is default Christianity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is so
or what they've at least been taught that.
Yeah. And so they read the Bible essentially through this modern historical critical lens that the Germans came up with, and a few other people, but primarily the Germans during the Enlightenment period.
Yeah.
And they so they're not actually reading the Bible differently. And this is actually all these questions that they're asking, all the way they're reading the Bible is fundamentally foreign to the way the church in Israel read the Bible before the Enlightenment or before modernity. The primary way, and really, in at least the historical method of reading the Bible, you can say in some sense, is a reductionist method. I remember there's a book by John Shelby Spong, who unfortunately was an Episcopalian.
Yes.
And he had a book called the Heresy of Literalism. And in Episcopal mainline circles, you often, in liberal Protestant circles in general, you often get this idea, this notion that literal reading of the Bible is always wrong.
Right.
And that's actually also a reductionistic.
Right,
The pre-modern way of reading the Bible was so much more multivalent than that.
Yeah.
Right? That there was always a literal reading. But that there is always also an allegorical or spiritual meaning.
Yeah.
And that's a sacramental way of reading the Bible, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that the allegorical, the spiritual method, or the spiritual or allegorical meaning is actually the Messiah himself incarnated or embodied in the Scripture.
And I think that's behind a lot of the movement toward different critical methods and narrative criticism and so forth later in the 20th century, right, was to step away from that argument about is it true, is it not true, right?
Yeah.
Because the true, not true argument is kind of a waste of time in a lot of sense, right? Because, and instead of saying, well, if you read the Bible literally or whatever, and I don't, we can still, be in communion in worship, and we don't have to argue.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that the way you see it, or how would you say it?
So I would say a couple things to that. I would say within Judaism, there's a line from the Mishnah that says, talks about argument for the sake of heaven. So arguing, at least in Judaism, is actually a good thing.
Yeah.
That's how we get to the truth. And so the joke goes, you have ask any three Jews their opinion, you get four answers, right? And I think Christianity is at its best when it's operating kind of within that mindset
diversity is good.
Yes, it's actually built into the very nature of God from a Trinitarian and even a Christological perspective. So on the one sense, like they're stepping away from the historical critical method, and they're stepping away from the questions that historical literal reading of the Bible is asking. But it's still slightly different, I think, than it's not is it true or not? There is truth in the Scriptures, but the truth in the Scriptures is always the Messiah. John 14:6
Right.
says, he claims that he is truth itself. And so and I like to actually talk about the Bible, rather than calling it the Scriptures or the Old and New Testament. I actually like to call it the faithful witness of Israel. And what this does is it avoids I think it gets to more this pre-modern reading of the Bible, avoids on the one hand this need for inerrancy, that we have to say every little jot and tittle. It's that's absolutely
if one iota is wrong, you're dead.
Yeah,
right?
according to modern standards, and which again is a very colonial way of reading the Bible, because it sets up modern Northern European cultural norms and standards as the standard for the Bible. And for the tradition.
It's kind of the R.C. Sproul way of looking at, where if it's either all true or all true or not true.
Yeah.
And with totally black and white.
Yeah, and this approach says it's all faithful. It's all the faithful witness of Israel, and the faithful God of Israel actually embodies the faithful witness of Israel to faithfully bring himself to us in the Scriptures. And so maybe a good way of talking about the pre-modern way of reading the Bible, it's not primarily, although I wouldn't completely discount it, but it's not primarily, you don't read the Bible, or actually traditionally you wouldn't read the Bible. You would hear it spoken in churches and synagogues, but when you hear the Bible, the main purpose of doing that in the community is not to gain information. It's actually to have an encounter with the divine word within the Scriptures, who is the Messiah himself present. So so if we talk about the truth that's present in Scripture as the Messiah, then it's always true in that sense. But he takes up the narratives and the stories of Scripture and the witness of Scripture as a body for himself, to witness to himself. But to ask it, is this inerrant or not, I think is the wrong question. Yeah. And that's what fundamentalists and liberal Protestants do. They both ask the question, is it inerrant? And that's the wrong question.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah. In fact, I'm hoping that we move beyond that someday, know. And so now you also in your book go extensively into Gnostic theology and how it kind of has sneaked into modern fundamentalism. Maybe wasn't there 150 years ago, but certainly is today. Can you explain what that means, that fundamentalism contains a lot of Gnostic thought? Yeah. And why is that a problem?
Yeah. So I'll start with describing what I was taught growing up in fundamentalist churches as the gospel. So you would hear a pastor up on stage and they would, say, I'm going to explain the gospel. And they would say, here's this bit of knowledge, this bit of information, and you need to, and I'm, summarizing and maybe characterizing it in a little bit, but here's this piece of information that you need to intellectually and rationally assent to. And if you do that, when you die, God will rescue your soul, which is really your real self. Your body isn't your real self. Right. From this, God will rescue your soul from your body and from this evil material creation, this flesh, and you will live in a disembodied state that we call heaven. Mm-hmm. And that is actually completely the Gnostic heresy from the early church, which has continued to survive throughout the ages. And that's often what fundamentalists believe, that their anthropology of what it means to be human is very much so. Actually, my grandma, who I love, the way she described it to me was that you are a man in the spacesuit is your body, but the real person is the soul inside. And that's that's straight up Gnostic. Yeah.
And very fundamentalist. So you will hear that from like fundamentalist Baptists a lot.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. And so, however it got in there, and my suspicion, I think, is probably the Enlightenment has some of this Gnosticism, like the Cartesian dualism of mind and body, where you are your mind rather than your body, and you're not limited by your body. That's a very Gnostic idea. So I think probably the Enlightenment has some of these Gnostic ideas that get carried over into fundamentalism that's adopting the Enlightenment as their worldview. So that's kind of what it is. Now, why this is problematic, and I talk about this in my chapter on Gnosticism threefold. One, it's problematic. If you don't want to be a fundamentalist, it's problematic because as a fundamentalist, you were a Gnostic. So if you're trying to get away from your fundamentalism, you need to reject Gnosticism. Yeah. Secondly, it's problematic because it's to blame for the current ecological and climate disaster. A number of scholars have noted this. They haven't called it Gnosticism. They'll call it Platonism or whatever, but Gnosticism is really kind of a runaway Platonism.
Yeah.
It's not the same. Platonism, I think, actually is probably not as bad as people give it credit for, but it's certainly a runaway kind of Platonism, gone wild. And people, Randy Woodley has pointed this out, N.T. Wright has pointed this out. And so I'm not new, except by maybe just calling it specifically Gnosticism, if I'm even new in that sense. But so if you believe that the material realm is bad and it's not good, as Genesis affirms, as the Jewish tradition that Christianity is part of affirms, well then you're not going to treat creation well. You're not going to bother to recycle. Right. You're not going to bother to create a political system that doesn't abuse nature.
Right. There's a nihilistic aspect to it. Is that what it is?
Yeah, because I mean, if your body's really going to rot away, if the creation is really going to rot away, then who gives a fuck, I don't know if you have to beep that out, but, what happens to all of this? It's really just about me, getting into heaven, right?
Right.
And so, and that has, if you look at Western culture, this is really the impetus for our current climate and ecological disaster. And the third piece is it's anti-Judaism. Yeah. If you look at the early church and Gnosticism, which I would not call Christian, because I think if you openly declare that you do not worship the God of Israel, you're not a Christian. Mm-hmm. Because to be a Christian is to worship the God of Israel, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And explicitly. And the Gnostics explicitly said they did not. Right. They worshipped a different God who didn't create this material realm, like the Jewish God. Mm-hmm. And actually, one Gnostic, Saturnius, I think was his name, declared that the God of Jesus, who was a different God than the Jewish God, came to destroy the God of the Jews.
Did the Gnosticism come out of Marcionism, or were they happening at the same time? The complete rejection of Judaism, or
I'm not exactly sure in the origins of exactly where Gnosticism come from. I suspect it has to do with some of the Platonism and stuff going on. Yeah. But it's certainly happening. Marcion was a kind of Gnostic. Yeah. So it's certainly early, and I think John is probably responding to some Gnosticism.
Right. Yeah, certainly.
And so it's showing up at a pretty early date in parallel with Christianity. So what's happening when people come along and they kind of just slap Jesus, so you show it into their Gnosticism. But it's fundamentally a different movement that is happening at the same time.
Yeah, the reason why I ask that is that in some of the later epistles, especially Peter's epistles, you definitely have an anti-Marcion, strain there, saying, no, we are not separate from Judaism. Yeah. No, we are, that. So, because that was a strong strain in the late first and early second century, right? That. So, yeah.
So actually the people that were the most virulent against Judaism and Jews were actually not Orthodox Christians, although they had that, but they weren't the worst. It was actually the Gnostics.
Okay.
Again, Saturnius said that the God, the true God, which was not the God of Israel, came to destroy the God of Israel. Jesus came to destroy the God of Israel. So they saw him as an evil Jewish God.
Yeah.
So there's this. So if you don't want anti-Judaism, which I think is a bad thing, and you shouldn't want that, then that's my third reason for rejecting Gnosticism.
Oh, okay. That's so cool. So a big part of your book also is just sort of like giving advice to help people who are making the journey that you made. Can you describe that a little bit, and what kind of advice do you give people who are starting to basically see that fundamentalism doesn't make sense anymore for them, and that they need to move beyond that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So what I would say is, based off of the fact that most fundamentalists are learning Gnosticism, that we were actually never taught Christianity. And so in that sense, my book is actually not, I've described it sometimes as a reintroduction to Christianity, but in that sense, it's actually just an introduction to Christianity. Because if you've never been introduced to Christianity, then you need to be introduced. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do in the book, is to reintroduce us, or to introduce us for the first time to authentic Orthodox Christianity. And I think my advice in a sense would be, and I'm doing that through as a Jewish Christian. I'm providing a Jewish Christian lens that's focusing on the Jewish aspect of Christianity as not a separate movement, but really the church dwells in the womb of Israel and draws its salvation from Israel as Yeshua says in John 4:22, salvation is from the Jews. And actually in the Greek, the is in the present tense, right? It's a continuous. So it's not, it was from the Jews, it is from the Jews. And actually, if you say, if you recognize that Yeshua is Jewish, when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, nobody comes to the Father except through me, what that says is the way, the truth, and life is a Jew. It's Jewish flesh and blood, and that the only way anyone can get to the Father is through Jewish flesh and blood. So there's this inherent Jewish core or Jewish contour shape to Christianity even now, that the salvation of anyone that comes to recognize Yeshua as the Messiah, the King who they're to have allegiance to and trust in, is actually always through this Jewish flesh and blood, because he is that. And so, that's certainly the lens I'm approaching it through. But I'm also, and I want people, I think that would be in my advice, is to listen to Jewish, Christian, and Messianic Jewish voices, which have been neglected. There's a new commentary, which I think is a great thing they're trying to do. It's called the New Testament in Color, the IVP put out. I was looking through the contents, and they've got Native American authors, Asian American, Africans, African Americans, which is all phenomenal, and I absolutely affirm all of it. However, they did not put the people in there as contributors that actually wrote the New Testament, Jewish disciples, Jewish Christians, Messianic Jews. And those kinds of volumes never include us.
Right.
So I would say, first of all, and if you're listening to this and you think, well, I don't even know where to start, that's fair. Reach out to Rob. He'll put you in contact with me. I'll give you a list. Because actually you can go to Yakabe Yeshua's website, and maybe you can put that in the notes. But that would be the first thing. And listen to the Jews who also don't believe Yeshua is the Messiah. There's a number of Jews that are helping to come along Gentile Christians and instruct them out of this anti-Judaism and into more Jewish faith. Now, and when I say Jewish faith, I don't mean converting to Judaism. I mean Christianity is a kind of Judaism.
I'd like to abolish the word convert, because the idea, and I've learned a lot from Jewish friends and congregants even, that there's it would be so much better if we saw each other as theological siblings, theological brethren, because we're really moving toward the same direction. We're still pointing to the same God, right?
So. And if from my particular Jewish Christian perspective, if salvation comes from the Jews, then a Jew can't convert. It's the Gentiles who are converting, right? It's not Jews that are converting. We already follow the God of Israel. If we're observant, then we're already following the God of Israel, even if we're not consciously acknowledging Yeshua as the Messiah, because there's only one God of Israel. So I think, conversion
there's more common ground than we recognize.
And that as well. So, but I absolutely agree with you. Convert is especially for Jewish disciples, whether Messianic Jews or Jewish Christians, is the absolutely, theologically, the most wrong word to describe what's going on. But so that kind of lays the groundwork for what I would say as my advice. I would also add that Christianity was around for 1,800 years before the Enlightenment, before liberal Protestantism and fundamentalism, and most of it is not from Europe. Most of it's not from Northern Europe. Most of it's from Southern Europe and North Africa and East Africa and Israel. And actually, Syriac Christianity is called the Christianity of Asia because it was in India by 200 AD, which is well beyond a lot of Europe, and it was in China by 600. There were parts of Europe that were still not evangelized when they were in China.
Darmay McCullough writes about that, about how Christianity, we tend to see it just in Western European point of view because of the dominance of the Catholic Church, right? And even the Orthodox Church that came out of that, but that totally misses the fact that the Syriac, India, China, of course, Ethiopian, Celtic Christianity, which are distinct as well. So, wow, I mean, it's so much broader, I think, than most people realize.
And really, right now, the resources are exploding to where easily accessible translations are coming out for Christian authors from these other traditions. And a lot of these traditions are still around, right? The Syriac Orthodox Church in India, who's existed at least for 1,800 years, is still there. They still exist. The the East Syriac, or Assyrian Church of the East, that's from Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, and Turkey.
Aleppo.
They're still around. And these
The
are people,
Armenians?
the
Or
Armenian
the
Christians,
Armenians,
the
yeah.
Georgian Christians. These are still around. These are people we need to be reading. And I would say, actually, I would make a distinction between the Roman Catholic Church as Southern European Christianity and Protestantism as Northern European Christianity, because that's really where the split happens,
Yeah.
is geographically, and there's a lot of cultural differences. For instance, my friend Michael, who's a Roman Catholic, and he's Italian. He's an Italian American. When I say Italian, I'm talking about his ethnicity. He was born in America, and his father and grandfather, I think, was born. I think his grandfather might be from Italy. But anyway, is the way he thinks and does theology is radically different from some of our Anglo theologians on the staff. It's actually much closer to a Jewish approach to doing theology. The Mediterranean world is much more relaxed, and even Southern Germany, where it's primarily Catholic, culturally is much different than the Northern European Protestants. They're maybe a little bit more wet and wild. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. And
they call Munich is the most northern Italian city is Munich.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that we can't listen to any Protestant voices. I make that very clear in the book. But I also think, we discount, and that's not to say the Catholic Church hasn't done terrible things, but we discount the Catholic Church as a distinctly Southern European religion to our own fault. And I'll say this last thing about it is that in the 19th century, the evangelicals and the liberal Protestants, they didn't want Southern European peoples to come to America because they would say, well, we don't want Catholics here. But that was actually tied to an idea that they were racially inferior.
Yes. Irish were racially inferior too.
Yes. And the Nordic the Nordic Christianity, i.e., Protestantism, was seen as superior because it was ethnically superior. It was Nordic people. So Southern the thing that people had against Catholics had to do with their racial origins from Southern Europe. And so anyway, all that to say is it makes things more complicated. But we have all these groups of Christianity, not just Protestantism, but again, I read Protestant and evangelical authors, but a Southern European Catholic tradition, which actually it's not just Southern European, comes out of North Africa too. And then, as we've mentioned all these ones, I don't need to go over. But so read these people, both contemporary scholars today, and also go read dead people for 1,500 years ago. We talk about reading brown people all the time, right, in our culture. But if you're reading, this might be a little controversial, but if you're reading a Korean, but he's Methodist and he does theology like an English Methodist person, he's not doing brown theology.
Right. Yeah.
But if you want brown theology, you need to go to the traditions that are brown. So like the Ethiopian tradition or the Coptic tradition, the Syriac tradition, or Judaism, or Armenian, or any of these kinds. And so anyway, all that to say is that would be my advice. Go read these traditions. And again, my book has a lot of those resources in there, but I'm happy if someone's like,
in fact, I did
me.
an episode on Celtic Christianity as an entry, as a way to understand indigenous faith. Because, if you're a white Northern European type person, you may have more trouble understanding, say, Coptic or other groups, but it's pretty easy for most to understand Irish and Scots-Irish, because a lot of us have a Scotch-Irish history, especially in America. So whatever entry path you have to engaging with indigenous faith will help you understand indigenous faiths everywhere. I think. And that's Randy Woodley talks like that too. Basically, that's idea is any way that you can understand what it means to have an indigenous faith is good.
And can I add something to that?
Sure.
And one of the things I talk about in the book, well, actually, I don't know if I say this in the book, but white supremacy was not just detrimental to Jews and black people and Native Americans. It was actually detrimental to Europeans.
Oh, absolutely.
It actually takes away the identity and the rootedness that the Irish had, that the English had, that the Germans had, that the French have, and the Dutch, and so forth. It actually took something from the people we call white people today, and it's a social concept. It's
homogenized them.
Yeah. And so I would say if you're someone of Northern European ancestry, whether it's Irish or English or German or French or whatever it may be, that if you want to fight white supremacy, you do so by indigenizing. You do
Yeah.
so by reclaiming your ethnic roots.
Right, where you
And-
come from.
Yeah, where you come from. And Celtic Christianity, particularly if you have a Celtic background, is a phenomenal way to do that,
Yeah.
because it is an indigenous Christianity
Mhm.
that shows, I'm not nearly as familiar with indigenous Christianity as I should be or as you are, but, not indigenous, Celtic Christianity,
Mhm.
but from what I understand, it certainly is a phenomenal example of what Christianity looks like enculturated in these particular lands. And
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's
Without
important.
Roman influences.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, is there anything you'd like to close on, or
Not that I can think of. No,
Okay.
yeah.
But anyway, thank you so much for being with us. Gabe's going to speak at my church tomorrow, and the book is great and really helpful. And I like we talked about with it, Randy Woodley is a professor of ours we know quite well, and just any way you can engage in this idea of rediscovering a Christianity that doesn't have all of the overlay of what we're used to,
Yeah.
fundamentalism. So thank you so much, Gabe.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
really
pleasure.
appreciate it. And like I always say is people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there. And God bless you, and God bless Gabe.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. Shalom, everybody.
Shalom.